All right. Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Andrew tēnā hou, ko James Ting Edwards here. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to be bringing you this Privacy Week webinar on AI and privacy. And since ChatGPT launched in late 2022, there have been lots of conversations about the future of AI. And in this session, we're going to take the opportunity to look back and ask what we've learned from 2.5 years of public-facing generative AI tools and their impacts on privacy. I'll be talking about the technology and sharing lots of embarrassing headlines. And James will talk more about the legal side and regulatory instruments to help us protect privacy in the AI age. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Office of the Privacy Commissioner YouTube page afterwards. And do feel free to put questions in the Q&A. The chat is disabled just so that it's not distracting us while we're speaking. But we will be able to look at the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to those questions at the end. And to introduce ourselves a little bit further, so my name is Dr. Andrew Chen. I'm currently Chief Advisor, Technology Assurance with New Zealand Police. And I'm joined by James Ting Edwards, Senior Policy Advisor at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And we each come to this topic from different directions. So I'm a computer engineer who picked up a bit of ethics along the way. And James trained in law and philosophy and picked up technology. And when we sort of combine our powers together, we become experts in this field of tethics. Which is not a real field. And if you've watched the show Silicon Valley, then you'll get a sense of how serious the rest of this talk is about to be. A quick disclaimer here that the thoughts in our brains that are currently escaping through our mouths are solely our own. Any resemblance to the opinions and views of our employers or the government are unintended, but it would be nice given that we think that we're right. So what are we talking about here? It's easy to kind of get lost in all of the hype and the jargon and all the words and kind of forget that at the core of all of this is this idea of intelligence. And I'm going to conceptualize these three terms as being sort of subsets of each other. But when we start with intelligence, it is about the ability to derive information, to learn from experience, and to correctly utilize thought and reason. This is a definition of intelligence. And so we can start from that place of thinking about what it means to be intelligent and then say, well, we want to make an artificial version of that, which is intelligence, but make it computers. And if we were a little bit more serious about a definition, we might say it's intelligence, but simulated, using algorithms and data to give the impression of thinking, to give the impression of intelligence. And I've been working in the area of AI for the better part of 10 years. Even that is still relatively new in the world of AI. The original coining of the term AI was in the 1940s. So it's a field that's been around for a long time that people have been trying to build these artificially intelligent systems. But of course, now we are in this world of generative AI, which is just AI, but people think it's cool now. They want to throw money at it. They want to employ people and give them jobs. And so I don't necessarily want to talk about the fact that I do AI anymore. I want to talk about the fact that I do generative AI. But more specifically and academically, it's artificial intelligence techniques that have been directed towards creating new content. And that new content could be in different forms of media, like text or audio or image and video information. And it might feel like ChatGPT has been around forever, and that is the only thing that we've been talking about for 2.5 years. But it did only launch right at the end of November 2022, based on OpenAI's GPT 3.5 model. It was only one day later that we had articles telling us why ChatGPT was not so good for us. But that didn't stop people flocking to ChatGPT, which at the time was the fastest software product to reach 1 million users, and achieved that in 5 days after its launch. It did get knocked off its perch about 8 months later when Mark Zuckerberg launched Threads, which reached 1 million users in 1 hour. But he did kind of cheat because he had a captive Facebook and Instagram audience already. And so ChatGPT, which became famous in November 2022, was actually just one in a long line of generative AI models by the company OpenAI. People like me were aware of these models that are on the left-hand side of this diagram, but very few people generally cared about these models until OpenAI made a nice user interface and made it freely available for everybody to generate endless amounts of Harry Potter fan fiction. And so here we can see the progression of these models over time. And you might be interested in what this number at the bottom is. So that number is the number of parameters in these models, which is a measure of the complexity or size of these models. So GPT-1 was 117 million parameters. GPT-3 is 175 giga parameters or billion parameters. And you can see right down to the right-hand side, GPT 4.5 is around 2 trillion parameters or 2 teraparameters. And of course, OpenAI is only just one company making these Gen AI models out of several billion-dollar companies. They're all trying to tackle text generation, image generation, video and audio generation, all trying to outcompete this guy, which we kind of just take for granted as being something that we all have access to. And I think it's sometimes helpful to kind of just reflect on where we are relative to this thing. So just for a comparison of how far away we might be from emulating human intelligence, the human brain is estimated to have about 100 trillion parameters, which is a lot more than 2 trillion parameters. It consumes about 20 watts of energy, which is the equivalent of asking ChatGPT about one thing every minute. And perhaps most significantly, the New Zealand Transport Authority values this thing and all of its associated hardware that can pick things up and lick them as being valued at about New Zealand $12.5 million, which is significantly less than the market capitalization of any of these companies. And now, of course, none of these metrics are perfect comparisons, but I think it can be helpful to kind of remind ourselves just how far away we are from that intelligence that we're still trying to artificially emulate. So now back to the theme of what we've learned since ChatGPT was launched. And so armchair AI ethicists quickly learned the phrase stochastic parrot, which came from a paper published in 2021 that asked the question, can language models be too big? Obviously, OpenAI saw this paper and said, no, we'll keep making them bigger. Nothing wrong can happen with that. But the metaphor of the stochastic parrot has two parts. It has the parrot, which is referring to how the animal can mimic human sounds without understanding what that sound means, and stochastic, which refers to the apparent randomness with which those sounds might be selected, including when you might have an occasional squawk in the middle of a sentence. This metaphor suggests that tools like ChatGPT, when we ask them a question, those tools don't actually know what the question means. It simply responds with statistically plausible characters that seemingly answer the question based on all of the words that it's heard before, that it's learned from. And hopefully everyone here will kind of be aware of this concept, but if you haven't thought about that before, just think about that for a moment, that when you're interacting with these chatbot AI systems, they give the illusion of knowledge and logical reasoning, but actually have no conception of what words individually mean. And this leads us to one of the big problems with generative AI systems. Very quickly after ChatGPT came out, we learned about hallucination, that generative AI models spit out confident responses that sound plausible, but are in fact false. They do this because these systems don't know what is true or accurate, just what characters or words might be probabilistically plausible. And so we see lawyers get embarrassed in court when the judge asks them why their cited case law doesn't seem to exist. We see Air Canada try to argue that they can't be held legally liable for the mistakes of their AI chatbot. Thankfully, the court said that that argument doesn't fly. And we get AI telling people that glue is an integral ingredient to pizza and that eating a rock a day is actually somehow good for you. And leading on from these hallucination problems were the loud complaints that generative AI seemingly couldn't answer simple logic questions that require some reasoning, that it was bad at math, even though it could seemingly do harder and more creative tasks like writing poetry, and that it couldn't count, especially when anybody asked these tools to tell them how many R's there are in the word strawberry. And while it is still true that generative AI systems today hallucinate, we are learning that over time, they are actually hallucinating a lot less than they used to. And this is measured against a standard benchmark for the correctness of the responses that's being given by these AI systems. And this axis down the bottom is time. The thing that is actually happening is not that these AI models are getting older and therefore smarter. It's that the models are getting bigger. And it turns out that the larger your AI model, the lower the likelihood of hallucination. And AI models have been getting a lot larger, which does pose some hope that in the future that maybe these systems will be hallucinating at a low enough rate that we might be able to consider them reliable. And on top of that, the companies building these generative AI tools have spent a lot of time adding to the core part of their models. So what we have in the middle here, you might call a large language model. And they're bolting on bits at the beginning to filter through the prompts and find the keywords. They're adding bits at the end to check the outputs and block answers that might be dangerous. They're adding in recurrent bits that feed the outputs back into the inputs and to try and get better answers. And they're doing external knowledge checks to try to verify the answers against reputable information sources. In some respects, the core language model itself hasn't necessarily gotten much better, but by adding all of these extra bits, they are helping to control what outputs users see and give the illusion of improvement. And all of that seems to be making the hallucination problems better, which is to say that the latest OpenAI model still hallucinates more than a third of the time in the real world. And hallucinations do have an impact on privacy because AI systems are generating false information about people and putting it in the wild. So this is a guy in Norway who asked ChatGPT who he was, and ChatGPT told him that he had murdered his two children and attempted to murder his third son and had been sentenced to 21 years in prison, which was all completely made up and not true at all, and would be quite psychologically jarring to read this about yourself when you didn't know that that was apparently the case. And in a New Zealand context, we would refer to Principle 8 of the Privacy Act, Information Privacy Principles, and note that an organization must check before using or disclosing personal information and ensure that it is accurate, up-to-date, complete, relevant, and not misleading. In the European Union context, an Austrian NGO has filed a complaint in March of this year against OpenAI for breaches under the GDPR to try and seek some sort of remedy for the types of harms that have been perpetrated by hallucinating AI systems. Now, OpenAI says that this specific type of hallucination shouldn't happen anymore because as of August 2024, ChatGPT searches the web for relevant information about people before answering about who they are. But this doesn't really help if ChatGPT has already generated an answer and that answer has already been published online, because where is the generative AI system going to fact check its information? Everything that's already been published online. One of the other big challenges around the use of Gen AI is around where the training data for these systems comes from. And while there are plenty of concerns about copyright infringement and intellectual property theft, in our Privacy Week context, one of the biggest concerns is around personal information being used to train these generative AI systems. And so, for example, Google used their web crawlers to retrieve as much content as possible from the internet, including lots of personal information from unclear origins. And one analysis of a common training data set found that there were medical records with full names and identifying details in that training data, which the generative AI might then repeat to other people who ask it questions. We know that Meta has been using social media content from as far back as 2007 to train its Llama system, regardless of whether the profile is set to public or private. And it hasn't helped that many users are voluntarily inputting sensitive and personal information into some of these free online generative AI tools, thus handing over the data freely to the developers of these generative AI systems. And we've definitely learned that despite all the media coverage and education work around how to use generative AI tools and what not to put into these tools, people will still keep doing the wrong thing anyway. These surveys that have been coming out, there was another one from the University of Melbourne about a month ago that showed more than half of users admitted to using these tools in ways that they knew they probably shouldn't be using them, and even higher rates of people knocking on their colleagues, saying that their colleagues have been using them in ways that they shouldn't have. Now, I should also note that we've moved on a little bit since 2022 in terms of these free tools. Most of the corporate generative AI offerings like Microsoft Copilot and Anthropic Claude now include some form of enterprise data protection. And this is where the providers of those Gen AI services promise not to use any of your data for training. Some people have claimed that this means that the data leakage problem is solved and that we don't need to worry about it anymore. But generally, you do have to pay for this. So if you're using a free service, then chances are any information that you put in is going to be at risk. And even if you do pay for it, you ultimately have to trust that these corporate entities are going to uphold their end of the contract. Which leads me to the last point that I'll be highlighting before I hand over to James. We've learned that despite priding ourselves in Aotearoa New Zealand on a number 8 wire mentality and being an innovative bunch of people, New Zealanders don't have great feelings of trust towards artificial intelligence. And there hasn't been this eureka moment of build it and they will come. So the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer showed us that 52% of New Zealanders reject AI as a significant innovation. And I would say that's pretty strong language to reject a terminology, to reject a technology. And this KPMG and University of Melbourne survey measured people's emotional reactions towards AI in various countries. Generally on the right-hand side, you see a black dot, which represents the percentage of the population that is optimistic about AI. The blue dots to the left, percentage of people who are excited, and the gray dots are the percentage who are worried. And when we zoom in right on down at the very bottom, we can see ourselves there, a really high percentage of us being quite worried. Unfortunately, Australia beats us in two things. One is the cricket, and the second is being more worried about AI than us. But of relevance to us is that only 34% of New Zealanders are excited about AI, while 60% of us are worried. And if we look for reasons why this might be the case, it might be easy to suggest that people are scared of what they don't understand. But actually, we do have another very relevant data point from the 2025 Internet NZ survey, which says that 68% of New Zealanders are worried about the malicious use of artificial intelligence, and in particular, the lack of regulation surrounding it. And so while the government wants increased uptake of AI in New Zealand, they have also ruled out AI-specific legislation, preferring a light touch, proportionate, and risk-based approach to AI regulation. And that regulation is in active development, but it's likely to only constrain the public sector while leaving the private sector free to experiment. This might signal that the government is pro-innovation, but it doesn't seem to be helping with the public's trust in these AI systems. And that is a big barrier to the absorptive capacity of New Zealand when it comes to AI. And it's something that I think those of us who are working to build systems for the public, we need to be really mindful of, because that's the public that or that's the operating environment that we're operating with. And we're building systems for a public that is perhaps currently more skeptical than welcoming of AI. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. I'll hand over to James here.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew has been relatively quick, and hopefully I'm planning to talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time to get into Q&A. So again, you can keep those questions coming. So we have heard from Andrew about kind of the history of these tools over the past couple of years, what goes into them and what comes out of them, and this intention to preserve existing regulations. One of the main ones in that space is, of course, our Privacy Act, which we're here to talk about for Privacy Week. And the theme for our talk is back to the future, looking at what we can learn from the history so we can do privacy on purpose. So Andrew is helping me with slides. Thank you. The Privacy Commissioner responded pretty quickly to the uptake of ChatGPT and the buzz around it in November 2022. So initially put out a statement of expectations for people using these models or looking at using them. And then we followed that up with more specific guidance on artificial intelligence and the information privacy principles. And the core of that guidance is really kind of straightforward. It is that the Privacy Act still applies. It doesn't matter what technology you're using. If you are collecting or using or sharing personal information, you still should be thinking about that in terms of the standard approach under the Privacy Act. But that said, having a bit of understanding of your context and of the technology is going to be very helpful for that. And we suggested the other way around as well, that if you think about privacy, that will help you make better use of these tools. So Andrew, could you move it on? So Andrew's talked in more technical detail, but I am a policy person thinking about, high systems and regulatory implications. And real high level, we are talking about personal information in terms of the input into these systems, the output, and then the bit that's buried in the things that computer scientists talk about as neurons that are not so visible to the rest of us. So there's the training data scraped from the web, or maybe in your system, if you have a model that you're deploying locally or training on your own data. And then there's the stuff that you or your users are getting back when they interact with the machine. And this kind of black box feature of what's going on seems like it makes it really hard to understand how smart is this system, what is it doing, but we can really cut to the chase in terms of what you do in terms of risk management and upholding your privacy responsibilities with the next slide. So AI, you might think means artificial intelligence. I'm going to tell you that it means assess impact. And if you do that in terms of what the training data is and what's going in, what the impacts could be in terms of sharing personal information and making claims about people, that's going to be the way that you understand risk in your context and make better, more informed decisions. So why do we assess impact? If we could go to the next slide. The Quebec Bridge is a famous example in the failure of engineering. It collapsed actually twice, but the first time in 1907 because the dead weight of the bridge itself was too much for the structure to bear. And I think 72 workers died in that collapse. And the response to that led to the professionalization and the establishment of the engineering profession as we understand it today. People realized they needed to be careful about their calculations and to take responsibility for the people whose lives might be on the line. But we're only talking about information, right? We can get a similar scale of impact, and we've seen examples of that overseas. So in Australia, there was the use of robo-debt, an automated system for assessing debts that people collecting social welfare owed to the government. The system assessed that they had overpaid, and in a huge number of cases, it was wrong. Similarly, there's part of the postal system in the United Kingdom relies on people kind of like our Kiwi Bank here who run post shops. They give you stamps, they receive things for posting, and the postal service there implemented an automated system called Horizon, and this assessed the potential for fraud by these sub postmasters, people working in that role, and a huge number of those cases were inaccurate. But despite this, in both cases, there were some prosecutions, people went bankrupt or spent years in court, and some people lost their lives as a result, of the emotional impact of that. So this is automation rather than generative AI, but these are really striking examples of why we need to be careful about where and how we use these tools and the very real impacts they can have on a huge scale, which is why, next slide, we have from the 1970s this slide from a presentation from IBM. A computer can never be held accountable, therefore a computer must never make a management decision. This is the core idea behind getting a human in the loop, and you have to be careful to make sure that the person in that role actually is going to independently assess and not just trust what the computer says. There can be a problem of automation bias, where because a computer has said something, people will rely on it, and that was a factor in the robo-debt and in the Horizon kind of situations that led to a lot of harm for people. All right, AI tools and privacy. We are talking about those kind of automated systems, which is where you have computers that control stuff. They might make a yes/no decision at the most basic level, turning on your heating or turning it off to maintain a temperature. You have algorithms, which we used to talk about a lot in the context of social media and putting stuff in your feed. So these put things into categories. And you have the more recent generative AI tools that Andrew's been explaining. And these are computers that can handle more complicated output that kind of can convey some conceptual meaning. One of the things that feels so distinctive about ChatGPT having kicked off this wave of interest in generative AI is that it feels like you are conversing. And that's not new. Next slide. Is a really early example of a interactive computer interface called ELIZA. And on the back end, this is a really simple program. You type in a query or a life problem, and by kind of cutting and pasting bits of the input that the system was getting, it would produce a response. Tell me more about how horrible your boyfriend has been to you. And people would attribute, as a result, a lot of intelligence and empathy to the system. And on the back end, if you dug into the source code, you could see it's really a kind of a simple set of if-then logic. So we have to be careful about what we attribute to these systems. Okay, let's go to the Privacy Act. Some really key ideas, and going back to basics can be helpful when we're dealing with these things that are new and feel unfamiliar. There's the agency who holds personal information. There's personal information, and that means information about an identifiable individual. And it can be personal information whether it's true or accurate or not, right? If you're making claims about someone, that is personal information about that person. And one of the things that these generative tools can do is make claims about people that are taken from the training data or that are inaccurate, just made up. And then there's this concept of purpose. So one of the key kind of governance features under the Privacy Act is that when you collect information, you should be doing that for a specific purpose. And that has been challenged by changes in technology over time. So next slide. Back to the age of algorithms, there was this buzz around big data, combining and reusing information from different sources to get new insights. And that might be from social media, or it might be from other sources of information. It creates a thorny question of what the purpose was that the information was collected for and what you want to use it for. Because it's tempting to say, we've got the information and we can do some cool new things with it. That's a tempting thing to reach for. But is it allowed in terms of what you're meant to have it for? Let's go on. The core in terms of your responsibilities under the Privacy Act is the information privacy principles, and they apply when you are collecting, using, or disclosing information. And next slide. Those have been in place for 30 years. Sorry, my formatting has covered that up, but it's just saying new ways to use information. So in the 1990s, the way you would get information into your organization or into a computer system might be paper records. It might be floppy disks and CDs. So my mum worked for the Citizens Advice Bureau and had a job driving disks around from branch to branch to update their databases. Then over the past 20 years or so, computers have become really normal. We rely on desktop publishing. People have got online. We've got smartphones and drones and other things that put sensors in a whole lot of places. And the way you get information in and out of an organization might be you have a network or you have a cloud provider and you control access to that. And that gives you some gates that you can manage to see what information is in there and what's it being used for. The era we're now entering with generative AI and tools that can kind of take text or images and read the text out of it, can identify faces, can take audio, and can produce those things, means that all those layers that you are relying on in your data governance are much fuzzier. So a situation where you would have had to have a person typing something in or speaking into a microphone, that could be something that is a generated output from a system. And these things are all going to combine with the trend of AI agents. So next slide, please, Andrew. Where you have that kind of automation that has been in use for a long, long time, and you're plugging it into these systems that can, so say, read or generate outputs that feel like they would be the kind of thing that a person would come from. So the headline is, I want you to assess impact and to understand which bit of the system you're responsible for. But who's responsible for which? Next slide. One of the challenges is you have these makers of tools who are taking masses of data and building these statistical associative networks of words or images. And then you have people who are deploying them in an organization or individuals who are experimenting with them. And one of the things we've learned is that there's a lot of people who are up for playing with this and seeing where it plugs in. And one thing that I found really interesting is an example from Europe. So there's this recent decision from the European Data Protection Board, and this is under the GDPR, so not our Privacy Act, but kind of influential on European and global practice with respect to personal information data governance. The Data Protection Authority in Ireland asked for an opinion about how you make this move from training data to deployment of a model. When are these models anonymous, and when can you rely on the legitimate interest, which is one of the legal bases for using personal information under the GDPR. And if we go to the next slide, the key decision, it's written in Europeanese, but what it comes down to, at least as I understand it, is if you can get personal information out of a model, then it's not anonymous, and you need to be thinking about the privacy impacts. If it is effectively anonymized, so you can't get personal information out, then that means there's a much wider scope of use without having to do an analysis of that personal information. So on the deployment side, if you can show it's anonymous, that's a way you can satisfy the legal requirements there. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back to our headline. And next slide, please. AI means assess impact. So on the training side, you can do the governance things that Andrew was pointing to in terms of filtering. And this is also a callback to the excellent talk earlier today from Sarah Heel. She said an AI system is only as reliable as what's gone into it. And controlling what you have in your systems and what you're using for training is a great way to manage risk there. You can also assess the impact of what's going to come out of it and what your application domain is and how sensitive that is. So if you are generating Hallmark style birthday cards, maybe there's a lower level of risk and privacy impact from that. And with that, I think that's about 15 minutes from me. So let's see if we have any questions.
Cool. Thanks, James. And yes, please do feel free to put some questions into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can, acknowledging that we are limited potentially in what we can and can't answer. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. How do you think Microsoft can use AI to help government agencies respond to OIA and Privacy Act requests? And I think the first thing that I'd say here is that I don't think James or I are going to simp for Microsoft. It could be any company that is developing these tools. When I think about this problem, I think that there are sort of two main steps. There are lots of other secondary steps as well. But in order to answer an OIA or a Privacy Act request, step one is finding the information, and step two is releasing the information, right? And so you would use AI technology in different ways to solve those two particular problems. I would say finding the information. If we are relying on human-driven systems, then having a natural language interface through an AI chatbot, etc., to help you find that information might be helpful. But there are probably bigger problems around document management and making sure that documents have the right metadata and tagging them appropriately to make sure that you can find them in the first place. And then second is that there's a lot of excitement about being able to automatically process documents and find personal information and redact it, or to automatically generate scores to suggest that this is releasable or that's not releasable, or to automatically assess it against the requirements of the legislation. And I think that that is where we're heading into, more dangerous territory, because those are really decisions that should remain the responsibility and account of humans who can be held accountable for those decisions. So you might be able to have an AI system that gives you a recommendation, but I think we're a while away from being able to do that robustly and reliably in a government context. Anything you want to add to that, James?
I think I will take that as a segue
Cool.
into
Next
a
question.
next question, because I think there's a lot of the same. I want to say a lot of the same things. So, next question, from your individual perspectives, how real and justified do you think the fear is that AI is going to take people's jobs? And I think for me, it is a mix of kind of factors about what these current tools are actually good at and the prospect that they will improve. So there's a lot of talk. There is always buzz and people seeking funding and customers on that side. There are also people recently talking about the kind of limitations of available data and whether with the training runs that have been done so far, tapped out the kind of public internet and all the available book sources and so on, so that the improvements may have been achieved. But on the other side, whether you're bringing in a computer tool to do someone's job, that's a decision that organizations and managers make, and they hopefully are thinking about the things Andrew's mentioned. So do you need someone to be accountable and exercise judgment? Do you need on the ground pragmatic kind of human experience as an ingredient? And most jobs require that to some extent. But there is a temptation to plug in tools where you might think you can save some salary budget. And so I think there's what the tools can actually do, and there's the temptation maybe in some parts of the economy to say, let's give it a go and see if it can replace people. And I really hope people are making good risk management decisions, because there's some unhappy places that could meet. What do you want to say, Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I do think that there is some classism in this question, not in the question asker, but just whenever we're talking about this topic. We've been talking about automation and the future of work for the better part of 10 or 15 years. And a lot of people probably thought that that was going to be an industrial context, because that's where previous automation has led to significant gains. And there were narratives that, the jobs that will be automated away are the people who are standing in factories, or the people who are doing cleaning, or the people who are doing fruit picking, the people who are doing low value jobs. And then when ChatGPT came out, suddenly it was the lawyers who are at risk, it was the creators who are at risk, it was the doctors who are at risk. And suddenly the whole conversation changed and people were much more worried about it. And I think that, it was one thing to kind of just flippantly tell truck drivers that they should just learn how to code and that would defend their livelihoods. It's interesting to see now that we're not, telling lawyers that they should just learn how to write code and then they'll be fine. There are, it's unfortunate that it's sort of evolved in this way, but in a sense, it's good that we're moving beyond some of these, actually ineffective ideas and interventions that will not lead us down a pathway of long-term sustainability as a society. And so, I mean, I do believe that there will be some job loss as a result of generative AI. I do think that it's probably, depending on which report you read, and maybe a little bit overblown. Things actually do tend to happen quite slowly, and there is time for people to respond and react. I think that there are legitimate concerns around, the
Just
changing
quickly
nature of work.
on the kind of rhetoric around learning to code, because I've been doing technology policy long enough, that was very salient for me. I think one of the interesting outcomes from the existence of these tools is generating code is not the interesting challenge, right? You can Um, for a long time, you've been able to go on websites like Stack Overflow and get technical solutions to a bunch of things. Probably, maybe what this highlights is that what you actually want is contextual judgment from people who understand your business need, understand what's appropriate in terms of the information environment you're working in, and can be responsible for that. And like that's maybe a more concealed bit of that kind of work that has been made more explicit now that you can automate bits of it.
Yeah, cool. So I'm gonna prioritize questions based on thumbs up. So if there's a particular question that you are keen to see answered, please do mark that thumbs up button. And so we have a question here that I think is probably more for James than it is for me, from George. Are there any plans in place by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner to bring organizations in New Zealand who are already experimenting with generative AI tools together to create a common space to share their insights and discuss possible security and privacy concerns?
So, magnificent question. I think it is a fantastic initiative to get organizations together and develop best practice. I don't think it's something that the Privacy Commissioner has plans to or potentially capacity to. But I suspect that if other people could make that happen, it's something that we would watch with interest.
Cool. And the next most popular question, I think, was the government chief digital officer in DIA has put out responsible AI guidance for the public service earlier this year. And in your opinions, what are good things it addresses, and what are things it could do better? And I think the first thing that I would start with is, guidance is okay, but certainly having an enforcement mechanism is better. And there are plans to develop that type of regulation in place. I do believe that one of the challenges is that we're probably about 12 months behind on this work. There are other governments, in particular, New South Wales has had one in place for over 12 months at this point. Other governments in Europe and places like that have been putting this sort of regulatory mechanism in place much earlier than we have here in New Zealand. And I think we see the results of that in things like a relative lack of trust in these systems. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that any of the principles in the guidance are wrong. In fact, the principles in most guidance and frameworks are all pretty much the same all over the world. They're all principles that we've been using for 10 plus years, and now are just being applied towards AI. So yeah, I wouldn't say that there's anything that I would improve on the GCDO guidance other than it could have come out earlier. James, anything you want to add there, or shall we go to the other question?
Let's go to the other question. I think it's broadly related. So the question is from an anonymous attendee: a friend's government employer has recently introduced Microsoft Copilot and seemingly are encouraging use of it, while my government employer has advised we are not to use AI in our work. Do you think there'll be a consistent government-wide approach in the future, potentially driven by the Privacy Commission? And so I think there's a bit of nuance here. Like, of course, it's desirable if everyone is applying good standards and from our perspective, doing their best to be privacy by design, consider the sensitivity of information, do that proactive work up front so that no one, staff, or the people being served are facing unacceptable risks. At the same time, it's probably the role of the leadership for the public sector to take responsibility for that. And I think they are to some extent, with reference to this GCDO guidance and potentially other things as well. I'd also say there's a bit of nuance in what level of rigor or safeguards might be appropriate depending on the agency and what kind of information they handle. And it might be desirable in some ways if there are agencies or bits of government that have lower risk activity, maybe to try some things out, and see how that goes in a way where the potential impacts are less severe. Bef you know, hopefully the agencies that are holding more sensitive information are being appropriate in their risk decisions as well.
Yeah, I think I would add that every agency has a different set of priorities and a different set of capabilities. as well, which then leads to a different level of maturity around the use of these sorts of technologies and a different level of readiness to exploit these technologies when they arise. You have this concept of absorptive capacity and an organization's ability to absorb new innovation. And some of the significant barriers to that, one is fiscal constraints. Another might be that you have a lack of internal capability to use that technology when it comes across. So it's one thing to say, oh, look, there's inconsistency between how different government agencies are applying their policies. But also, I think that it is often just down to the readiness of those organizations to adopt that technology. And on that note, I'll just make a quick plug that police now has an acceptable use of generative AI policy. And it is expected that we will have some form of generative AI tool available within the next couple of months. And I would say that police handles quite a lot of sensitive personal information. And so if police can figure it out, then I'd hope that most government agencies could. But of course, understanding that every agency is in a different place on the journey. So the next question is one from Kat. So from your perspective, who is responsible for ensuring government users are appropriately trained in safe AI use? This means ensuring that those using AI agents on the behalf of the government have consistent knowledge and skills around data protection and privacy when using those tools. I think this might be a James question.
So in the first instance, compliance with legal obligations, including the Privacy Act, is up to you and your agency. But that said, the Privacy Commissioner does try and put out guidance to make it easier for people to understand those obligations. So, there's systems level bits that we try and do. Running Privacy Week as an example of trying to raise awareness and get people thinking about this. But then hopefully people are going back and working with their privacy teams and their legal teams. There might also be other layers. So some people who work for government are members of professional bodies, and that's also an avenue and a space where people could be thinking about what they, as a profession, can be doing to uphold privacy. But kind of the same answer to an earlier question, agencies and then leadership across the whole public sector hopefully are, and I think we're seeing some examples of doing things to lead on what good looks like so that people can pick that up where they're living and working.
Yeah, and I would add that this is not the first revolution in corporate productivity. And we've been here before. And when you look at like a generative AI tool and how it would fit into a corporate structure, in some regards, it is no different to Microsoft Word or emails. And somehow, as a society, we moved from a world that didn't have Microsoft Word or emails to a society where we're all using it every day and most people are pretty proficient at it. And maybe that is on a longer time scale than people might find acceptable for the use of generative AI, but it's a process of learning as a society that we've done before and we will do again. So we've got this question from George that James has highlighted. I'll just read it out. So for content, whether that's text, images, or code generated by Gen AI tools, who holds the copyright or intellectual property rights over this generated content? And are there any non-legal implications for commercial use of Gen AI generated content, especially if it resembles existing copyrighted works? And I think I'll preface this by saying this is not legal advice. And I'll also say it depends a lot. There's a lot of things that are currently still happening in this space, and I don't think it's a settled question. But I'll go to James because I think you probably have a better answer to this than me.
Yeah, so it's debated, right? And of course, when I talk about copyright, I'm not talking for the Privacy Commissioner, but copyright is massively debated. I have spent time working on it. It is supposed to be about encouraging and enabling people to make things and do that in a commercial way. So we get books and films and music and all that other lovely stuff, and also business documents. I would point to the recent output from the Registrar of Copyrights in the United States, because the broad scale policy argument is whether the use of all the stuff that has been scraped and fed into the large language models and other tools, is that fair use? And you've kind of got at it with the last part of this question. If you have scrapped everyone's work and the output can then compete with that work, that's probably well outside the way that copyright people would think about the policy intent behind copyright existing. Um, but yeah, I would just say check out that analysis and the kind of back and forth about it, which is going on Blue Sky and potentially elsewhere on the internet right at the moment.
Cool. We'll come to the next question from an anonymous attendee. Oh, it's just disappeared. It's just moved. Great. What changes, if any, do you think we need to our regulatory frameworks to overcome the lack of public trust in AI and other technologies? And I think first and foremost, I think that there's some regulation happening, which is good. I think that there are probably two bits that I would look at in either direction. One is scope. So right now, the only regulatory frameworks that we're really exploring in New Zealand are for the public sector. And to be fair, the public sector is a steward of sensitive and personal information, in many cases more so than the private sector. But there are private sector entities that also manage a lot of information and could use that in poor ways through generative AI tools. So I do think that if we're going to have rules for the public sector, then we need to have some rules for the private sector, acknowledging that those rules might need to be a little bit different. There's a question around scope also around, is it really just generative AI systems, or how are you defining the scope of systems that need to be subject to this sort of regulation? And then on the other end of the spectrum is enforcement. I'm not super worried about exactly what the rules are, in part because I think that the principles that we'll be drawing upon are relatively well tested and have been used all around the world. And so I don't think we're going to find it hard to identify, what are the rules what rules need to exist. But having the rules and not having any penalties, or having penalties that are light, that are ineffective, means that we might as well not have the rules at all. And so that's where I would be looking, is scope and enforcement to add to the sort of regulatory framework that we're building already. James, anything you want to add?
Well, I'm not going to endorse the if you don't have penalties, then why not have the rules at all? My,
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
my view is that New Zealand has a very high trust, kind of compliance seeking, risk averse culture in lots of contexts, particularly in the public sector and also in NGOs and also across most businesses. People want to do the right thing. And that's a lot of why we get good outcomes. Some of that relates to us being a relatively small and tightly knit place where people don't want to lose reputation. But whatever the reason, people want to do the right thing. The Privacy Commissioner has said that there are challenges from new technologies that enable new ways to interface with information, and that it would be desirable for New Zealand to look at comparator countries like Australia and the UK and Canada, who have a different set of remedies and responses. And that's kind of something that could be considered as a regulatory move, to address some of these increasing risks. I'm going to roll into a question from Rick, who says, re-identification was already an issue before Gen AI. Do you think Gen AI means the ability to be anonymous has or will disappear as LLMs access massive data sets and match disparate data points? And so I'm not the person to go to for an information theoretic analysis of like how much do you have to hide a piece of information before it is tractable, before it's possible for other people to link it up and re-identify it. There's a few factors here. There's kind of the computational power. Obviously, there's big supercomputers that are building the models we're talking about, but also it's a lot about what information is available. Can it be linked? So things like large social media networks are a repository of lots of information about lots of people, and you can infer things about people who are not even using the service because of their connections to others. So that those big data sets existing is a resource that can be brought to bear. I think that the large language models and similar kind of transformer deep neural network based systems, they're kind of a complicating factor because on the one hand, they generate a lot of stuff and it might be easy to hide among that stuff, but also they can do some really interesting things in correlating data points. So just recently, I've seen commentary on geolocation, where you can feed models a photo and it will very reliably pinpoint very accurately where on the globe that photo would have come from. So that's a really interesting change in the information environment. And all I can say, Rick, is I think we're going to have to grapple with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that there will still be ways to be anonymous if people choose to. They might have to make hard choices in order to be able to do that, such as just being offline. But I do think it is also worth pointing out that to some extent, we benefit from a little bit of privacy by obscurity here in New Zealand. There are some analyses of the training data that is used by some of these big companies. And one analysis that I saw suggested that 68% of all of the training data came from the US and North America, and only 1% of the training data came from Australia and New Zealand. And so that gives you a little bit more of a chance of protecting yourself if you are from a jurisdiction like New Zealand. Notwithstanding the fact that a lot of our information about ourselves might be overseas anyway, because we all use services that are hosted overseas. But yeah, just sort of acknowledging that if you really want to be anonymous, you might have a slightly better shot doing it here than in the US. I thought that we just close with one very practical question. So we have a question here from Laura that asks, Microsoft Teams has the ability to create minutes for recorded meetings. Is there a risk of in-house information being available to those outside the organization? And this is not cybersecurity advice or legal advice. Don't sue us if we give you the wrong advice. In fact, you should ask your cybersecurity people in your organization. But generally speaking, if you're paying for Microsoft Teams, then there should be some form of commercial or enterprise data protection that should mean that any information that is processed through those systems will not be used for training, that it will stay within your system, and it should be safe to use. And I say that because a company like Microsoft needs to make sure that it can offer that, because otherwise corporates or any large entity that is trying to handle sensitive and personal information would not use their product. So to some extent, there are promises that are being made here, but these have been vetted by security risk analysts and that sort of thing. So I would say if you're worried about this, check with your cybersecurity team. But the answer is probably that it should be fine if it's a product that you've paid for and has these sorts of protections in place. James, anything you want to add there?
I think that's a reasonable expectation. I really hope pragmatically that that's the answer because yeah, that the I would say look at the information flows and try and get confident yourself. And if you want a reference point on that, I would say again, the talk this morning from Sarah Keel on content management and getting ready for artificial intelligence is a really good resource for thinking about that in a practical way.
Cool. Well, I'm sorry, Chris, because I did mark your answer, your question as one that we'd answer, but we are at 2:30 now. So we will wrap it up there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to hear James and my thoughts as we all try to navigate through this wild and wonderful world of generative AI and how it's affecting and completely reshifting society together. And with that, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much, and we'll all see you soon.
Bye bye.